when you ask a human being to think about a ladder, they're always getting into that social comparison mode. And they're often getting into the social comparison mode in the mindset of finances, because you're always thinking about another step on that ladder. If I double my income, I might be twice as happy, as what's going through your head. When in reality, once you get past some basic needs, if you double your income, it gets you about 7%. So you might strive that much for 7% higher well-being of not having to worry about stuff or whatever it might be. But once people get to a certain point, chasing that ghost of doubling your income is essentially quicksand that never goes away, because there's always someone you're looking at next to you who's making a little bit more. So once you've met your basic needs from a financial standpoint, you need to make a pretty hard pivot to say, how can I make sure I'm working on things that matter, that I feel good about, that allow me to spend time with my friends and loved ones, and that give me the right quality of life, instead of just chasing a bigger title, more status, more followers, more impact, and the like.
Welcome to Leadership, the podcast where leadership meets real-world insights. In each episode, you can eavesdrop on exclusive conversations with top thought leaders, best-selling authors, and experts in leadership, communication, relationships, culture, and everything else that shapes your effectiveness in the workplace and in your personal life. Leadership is here for you. Now, here's our host, himself a seasoned coach and best-selling author, Dr. Rodger Dean Duncan.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to Leadership. Let's begin with this question. What's the point? It's a deceptively simple question, and one that most of us rarely stop to ask. We fill our days with meetings, metrics, and motion, assuming that productivity equals progress. But what if we are optimizing our schedules while slowly disconnecting from what actually matters? For this episode of Leadership, I'm joined by Tom Rath, one of the most influential voices in modern leadership thinking. As the #1 New York Times best-selling author behind landmark books like StrengthsFinder 2.0, How Full Is Your Bucket, and Well-Being. His work has shaped how millions of leaders, teams, and organizations think about strengths, engagement, and what it truly means to thrive. But his newest book is unlike anything he has ever written. It's called What's the Point? Turning Purpose into Your Daily Superpower. And it is Tom at his most honest, most urgent, and most unfiltered. At the age of 15, Tom was diagnosed with a life-threatening genetic cancer syndrome. Doctors gave him maybe 20 years. That ticking clock gave him something most people never get: radical clarity about what actually matters. In his new book, Tom draws from a life shaped by a profound sense of urgency. He makes a compelling case that purpose isn't something you discover someday. It's something you apply moment by moment in the work you're doing right now. This conversation won't be about abstract philosophy. It'll be about practical clarity and about asking better questions, especially when you're busy, successful, and still wondering why something feels a little bit off. If you've ever questioned whether your work truly matters or how to make it matter more, this episode will challenge you in all the right ways. And you'll find yourself asking, what's the point? Tom Rath, welcome to Leadership.
Thanks so much. It's great to be with you.
Tom, when you turned 40, the age you were never supposed to reach, you had what you call a brutal realization. What was that moment like, and what did you discover about the life you'd been living?
You know, it's kind of funny, Rodger, you mentioned the urgency in the introduction, and I had this sense of urgency after that diagnosis about, I kind of need to live a full life by the time I hit 37 was my marker in my head, right? So I'm trying to achieve everything I can professionally and make enough money to sustain myself and my family. I was fortunate enough to meet my wife, and we've been married almost 20 years now and have kids who are 15, 17. And so I felt like I was kind of doing the things I knew I should be doing. But when I stepped back, especially after the age of 40, and started to think about and work on what became this book, I realized that a lot of the expectations I was trying to live up to, and even the things I was doing throughout my career, were 90% of it was about other people's expectations and societal expectations, what my mom did and what my grandparents did. And it really didn't have a lot to do with making sense out of what I should be doing, what I could be best at, and why I'm doing those things in the first place on a daily basis. So the more I really tried to take an objective look at that, which has been a core part of all the books I've worked on over my career, is trying to be as objective as possible, I realized that like 90% of us, I'd kind of fallen into defaults of what I was doing and why I was doing it for the first 40 years of my life.
So you describe What's the Point not as a philosophy, but as a daily compass. Tell us more. How does someone actually use this question in the practical flow of a workday?
Yeah, I mean, that's the thing I love about it is we got into, this kind of came up as we were working on what to call this book and how to frame it. And we originally were calling the book, I think it was Purpose Unlocked, and the book was just going to be all about purpose. But when 90% of people hear the word purpose, they kind of close in and they're freaked out by it because it sounds like this big, scary thing that you have to find once in life and then you're done with it. And as we got into it, we realized that if you dissect what purpose really is, purpose is waking up early in the morning and realizing you need to go get some activity so you can have more energy to be creative in the morning. Purpose is shutting off a bunch of your notifications so you can get some of that work done. Purpose is eating well so you have enough energy. And for me, I mean, maybe the greatest purpose I get in a given day is at the end of a relatively productive, energetic day, I sit down with my kids at dinner and keep my devices stowed away and ask them some questions. And I get to hear about how their day went. And that's where real purpose is built and occurs in a day. It's in relationships. It's in creating new things that make a difference for other people. It's in those conversations. It's not in some grand quest. If you get real clinical and diagnose it, it's maybe as practical as anything you can do in a day.
Yeah, and anybody can do it.
Anybody can do it today.
Now, you write that most people are so busy being busy that they have forgotten to ask why. Tell us a little more. What is the difference between being productive and being purposeful?
Yeah, the one other thing, as I've traveled around in the last few weeks and from airports and hotels and kind of walking around on streets, we are so dialed into all of the things that we can respond to. So my biggest response addictions are probably email and watching stock ticker prices during the day when neither one of those yields a lot 5-10 years from now, right?
Yeah.
And for more people, it's just scrolling kind of mindlessly through devices and social media feeds and the like. And that's easier to do. And it's even maybe more enjoyable in the moment. And I know that gets villainized a lot too, but if I'm in a long line at a grocery store aisle or to get on an airplane, that's really helpful. And you kind of pass time a little easier than getting all worked up and worried about it, right? So I understand that being responsive and consuming is always going to be a part of our lives. But yet, most of us, I don't think most people take even 10 or 20% of their day to say, I'm going to tune that out and actually create something that will make a difference a week from now, a year from now, maybe even a decade from now. And that doesn't have to be creating a book or a work of art or music or anything like that. It can be investing an hour in a relationship with one of your good friends, someone you manage, your spouse. It's really those small things that add up and make a difference is what I've learned from some of my work. But you do need to think more consciously now than we did 5 or 10 years ago about the balance of time between just responding versus initiating or creating something, I think.
Well, today we have more ways to misuse our time than we once did, I think.
So true.
So you argue that purpose has been hijacked by influencers and life coaches selling anxiety. What do you regard as the real definition of purpose, and why has the word become so distorted?
Yeah, I have a very simple definition of purpose the more I've kind of worked through this. And I think the more simplistic I can make it, the more clarity it gives me, at least, in terms of purpose is something you do with your effort and talent that serves another person. And I've done a lot of research in my graduate degrees in kind of positive psychology and happiness. And I think the mistake that a lot of people make is focusing inward and on their own happiness, when really, if you want to have purpose in your day and meaning when you look back at your work retrospectively, the most important thing you can do on a daily basis is spend as much time as possible focused outward and saying, how can I take who I am and what I'm good at and do something that makes a difference for another person? And that might be making a cup of coffee at a Starbucks. That might be helping a customer in a retail store. That might be satisfying an agitated customer who's calling in. Might be if you're a manager or a leader, having a conversation with someone who works for you every day and helping them to see something that they might be better at. So it's those little things that really make a difference, and we need to see if we can focus more time on. I think if I were to say to people, don't worry about these grand quests for mission and meaning and purpose, just ask yourself what you can do for another person more frequently starting today, basically.
Sure. Well, the happiest people I know have that orientation. They absolutely do. And as you allude to, it's not necessarily the big things they do. It's the many, many little things they do. Engaging a stranger in a line at a store or something. And it makes all the difference in the world. There's no doubt about that. Now, Tom, you say passion is a luxury item, a first world problem dressed up as universal wisdom. Now, that's a provocative position for someone who's spent years working on strengths. How did your thinking evolve?
Yeah, it's interesting you ask that, because as much as I have kind of grown up and my grandfather started a lot of the work and science around strengths many, many years ago. And it's been amazing to see how that's been so helpful and influential for tens of millions of people to learn more about their natural talents, figure out who they are. But one common mistake I see is that when someone learns about their natural talents and they say, oh, look at me, here's who I am, and they put their top 5 strengths all over, and when they're in job interviews, they want to tell the interviewer all about who they are, when really the purpose of uncovering who you are is so that you can figure out the best way to serve other people and turn that lens outward. And so if you say, what are my passions? I might be really passionate about golf or music or some of these things that I personally, when I was a kid, there is nothing I was more passionate about than basketball, but there was absolutely no chance with my body composition and talent and chemistry that I was going to use that to productively serve people as I got older.
Yeah.
Right. As much as I would have loved to. So I think we've got to learn pretty early on that as much as it's fun to be passionate about things that could be really good hobbies and you could enjoy in your recreational time, I think when you think about a career or a vocation or something that you're going to do productively for 30, 40, 50 plus years to serve people, that probably starts on the demand side of the equation and asking what the world around you needs, what your community needs, what your friends and family need, and not saying, how do I take what I'm passionate about and just hope that the world catches that, right?
Right. Well, most people, you say, will finish their careers without ever discovering what they could have done best due to what you talk about as a profound lack of exposure. What does creating that exposure look like in practice?
I personally, the more I've worked on this for 4 or 5 years, relatively full time now, I think that's the problem in society that haunts me most at night, every night, is that if you think about the way we learn about careers and the way we discover what people need and what's out there, I'm pretty confident that at least 80, maybe 90+% of people make it all the way to the end of their life, and they never really uncover what they could have done best in serving other people and in serving society. And so with kids who are 15 and 17 right now, I see it live and in person every day, where at those ages, they're already being encouraged to think about, what do you want to focus on? What do you want to major on when you get to college? What do you want to do? And no one's ever pulled the curtain back and said, do you even know what jobs are out there? So and I've asked my kids, I asked my daughter when she was 14, what do you think you might want to be? And my wife's a 2nd grade teacher, and I'm a writer, obviously. And she said, well, maybe a writer, or I could be a teacher too. So she's seen 2 things pretty close, right? And so I went back and did the math on all this. And when I look at the Bureau of Labor Statistics data, you need to understand 50 jobs just to get 50% of what the labor force is in the United States. So to be able to have a 50% field of view, if you're a 15-year-old, you need to see 50 different jobs. But yet, on average, by the time they enter the workforce, most people see maybe what mommy did, what daddy did, what one other mentor did. Maybe they had an internship, but it's no more than 5. Mm-hmm. So you're looking at roughly 5 to 10% aperture in terms of if you think about a camera lens, in terms of the field of view of what you can see by the time you're forced to make a major choice. That's even after you've decided on where you spent 4 years of education, what you might want to do as a first job. So And then obviously people bounce around a little more now, which you could debate. And maybe some of that's helpful because they get more exposure to different careers. But I think we need to figure out as a society, especially late high school, early college, how can we get young people an easier way to have exposure to what's out there that's not just kind of falling into that default of what mom did, what dad did, or what pays the most, basically.
Well, that certainly sounds like some dinner table conversations that more parents should be having.
Yeah.
So you describe status seeking as career quicksand. Why is comparing ourselves to others so destructive, and what do you personally compete against instead?
Yeah, I think the thing I've learned in studying human well-being for almost 20 years now is that one of the most used questions to ask people all over the world about their quality of life or satisfaction with life is a question developed decades ago by a guy named Hadley Cantrell. It's called the Cantrell's Ladder of Life. And the question asks people, if you imagine a ladder, this translates pretty well, it's why it's used, on what step of that ladder with steps numbered 1 through 10 do you stand today? Where do you think you'll stand in a year? And then you kind of look at, are people going up or down on that ladder? Mm-hmm. And as much as it's the most widely used question, I've always kind of argued against it and never liked it as much because I think when you ask a human being to think about a ladder, they're always getting into that social comparison mode. And they're often getting into the social comparison mode in the mindset of finances because you're always thinking about another step on that ladder. If I double my income, I might be twice as happy as what's going through your head. Right. When in reality, once you get past some basic needs, if you double your income, it gets you about 7%. So you might strive that much for 7% higher well-being of not having to worry about stuff or whatever it might be. But once people get to a certain point, chasing that ghost of doubling your income is essentially quicksand that never goes away because even once you get to being a millionaire or a billionaire, there's always someone you're looking at next to you who's making a little bit more. So once you've met your basic needs from a financial standpoint and you're not worrying about paying rent and paying the bills on a daily basis, you need to make a pretty hard pivot to say, how can I make sure I'm working on things that matter, that I feel good about, that allow me to spend time with my friends and loved ones, and that give me the right quality of life instead of just chasing a bigger title, more status, more followers, more impact, and the like.
Well, that career quicksand metaphor is very powerful, and I've seen a lot of people who are struggling with that. I hope they'll read your book. Tom, you say that people should never go with the flow. You argue that going with the flow means imitating others and becoming replaceable. Inside a large organization, what does being aggressively authentic look like? That's one of your terms that stuck out to me, aggressively authentic.
Yeah, I think, the central point from all of the strengths research that I've been a part of, clearest way to encapsulate that I've come up with is you can't be anything you want to be, but you can be more of who you already are. And being more of who you already are is how I would define aggressive authenticity, where it's if you walk into any corporate environment today and you're just kind of watered down version of you and trying to be a little bit like a bunch of things and fit into societal expectations, especially in this day of AI, where if you're doing things that are kind of autonomous and repeatable, you're clearly replaceable. I think your only option is to say, how can I stand out and be more of who I already am, and to figure out how I can take what I can uniquely do better than any other 10,000 people and focus as much time as possible in those areas so that I can contribute as much value to the world and help as many people as possible. And the more that you can understand how you do that and where you do that and continue to build on it. And then maybe most importantly, how can you help other people to see that and build on it? Because most of us are kind of bad at seeing that on our own. So that's even more valuable for managers and leaders in particular.
Well, your response to that question is going to be a key part of my next conversation with my grandchildren. That's very insightful.
That's where it really comes to life. I'm telling you, with young people right now, to kind of get into that diagnostic mode is probably more valuable than ever.
Yeah. So you make the striking claim that a miserable job is measurably worse for your health than being unemployed. What does the research show, and what should someone do if they find themselves in that situation?
Yeah, I think when you look at the kind of experiential, the daily well-being research on stress and happiness and boredom and all those kind of momentary elements in work, 14 out of 15 are worse off, if I remember correctly here, if you're in a job that you really hate and it's a bad job, than if you're unemployed. So there's one element that might be a little bit better. But in general, if you're in a state where you're chronically stressed out and maybe you have a bad boss, it's a work environment that you don't like at all, that's about as toxic, not only for your well-being, but for your health and your engagement overall, as anything else I've seen. So I've seen far too many people tolerate a job that they're either miserable in or clearly unhappy. I mean, there's some that are kind of in that neutral range where if you're doing it to get by and you know it's not perfect, but it pays the bills and you're waiting to get to the next job, that's fine. But the ones that really make you miserable when you go home and you're a lousier parent or spouse or friend and you know it because of that job, I think people need to maybe jump even a little quicker than they do on average versus tolerating something that's really difficult.
There are a lot of people in that situation, there's no doubt. So you argue that any role can be elevated from a job to a calling by focusing on its inherent social value. Is that accessible to everyone, or does it require certain privileges?
I think it's accessible to everyone. And I guess I'm sure there are some cases where you probably need to change the job from what you're doing if it's not something where you can say the work I'm doing today makes the life of X person a little bit better. So, I mean, if you're manufacturing cigarettes, I don't know, I could make an argument for that. I mean, there's some cases like that where, I mean, if you're in an industry where what you're doing is creating societal problem or addictions or whatever it might be, if you can't draw some of those lines to how your role is actually being helpful at mitigating that problem, that's a different case. But in most roles, I've found that people can tie back how what they did in a given hour in a day made things a little bit better for, even if it's just taking someone who's calling in to your hotline or whatever, and they're really irate and they're at a -8 on a -10 through 10 scale, and getting them to a -4, that is a victory, and you need to kind of acknowledge that, right? And so if I have a conversation with someone who works with me and they're really stressed out about something, and I get them to at least get back to kind of a neutral line, I need to acknowledge in my day that that's a little bit of a victory. And we often fail to just connect the dots with those little wins throughout the day. And so I think you kind of do that to get started. And then in an ideal world, if you could go home each day and say, what did I do that was a real transformative experience and truly made a difference for someone and made their life a little bit better? If you're a teacher, you might have helped a student to work through a problem where they were really struggling. It's those things that make a difference. The biggest problem, honestly, is just that we're lousy at connecting the dots, not that we're not doing that stuff. So when I talk with hospice nurses or teachers or cancer physicians, oncologists, they're doing this stuff every single day, and they just fail to look back and say, here's where I did something that made a difference. And that's what really helps them to sustain their efforts over time.
Well, and to repeat some of those things that made a difference.
Your change initiative has the budget. The strategy looks solid, and everyone's nodding along in the meetings. But for some reason, it's going nowhere. Dr. Rodger Dean Duncan knows why. After 40 years in the trenches with top business leaders, he knows that change fails when organizations lack the right foundations: trust, accountability, and real communication. Dr. Duncan's free 10-minute assessment shows you exactly where your organization stands. Answer a few straightforward questions that reveal your true change readiness level. Don't waste months discovering the hard way. Get your free assessment today at leadershop.net/change. Again, that's leadershop.net/change.
Tom, in this conversation, I find myself imagining being a teenager sitting at the dinner table, looking across the table, and my dad is Tom Rath, asking these questions. Your children are blessed.
Well, you know, I've learned with my kids, I'm very careful not to preach or talk about this stuff too much, because I find that they learn a lot better through kind of side conversations and examples. So it's not at all what you would imagine in my household.
Yeah. You don't have a flip chart by the kitchen table. Yeah.
I've learned the hard way that backfires.
Yeah. So for many people, you say the smartphone is the single greatest threat to their purpose. Tell us, what specific boundaries do you suggest?
Yeah, I think that might be one of the biggest practical challenges of our generation and time right now is how do you make sure that you're using your smartphone instead of it using you and consuming all of your time, basically. And so I've tried to view my iPhone as a tool to change my thermostat or get the weather when I need it or get my boarding pass, whatever it might be, instead of it being something that's kind of a pacifier that I use to replace boredom, essentially. And so the other thing, the number of, I've noticed this with my kids' phones when I'll be helping them with something, the number of notifications and dings and buzzes, I've silenced 90% of that. And if I had all those things going off, I don't know how I'd get a constant thought together for 30 seconds. So I think doing a big inventory and overhaul of your notifications, using your focus and do not disturb modes more, and asking yourself really clearly, if you shut those things off for 30 minutes, for an hour, maybe even 2 hours, what could you get done? Could you put together a new piece of music if you're into writing music? Could you read a book, a real print book or something for an hour or two and learn something? I have learned, though, in 20, 30 years of just spending hours every day researching my own health and medical journals and research, my web browser and my phone are the greatest tools I've ever had for learning and deep research. And so if I can turn those around, which I've been able to a large degree, to be the greatest information discovery tools and not just something that distracts me and leads me to scroll and consume all day, then I think you can make those devices work for you and you kind of own the device instead of it owning you psychologically.
I think all that requires some very deliberate thinking and forming new habits. There's no doubt about it.
But it's new habits. I don't think it's willpower. I don't have any more willpower than anyone else in terms of eating bad things or consuming media or whatever, but it's kind of going in there and checking settings and changing notifications and using your focus mode and asking yourself if you want to just kind of give 4 hours a day away to doom scrolling or whatever, because nobody really wants that when you talk to them. So I think it's making a plan to change those things, which all of us can do over time.
So you write that people are not self-made, they are other-made. What role do relationships play in finding and amplifying purpose, and how do you deliberately hunt for the right ones?
The role they play, I would say, is all of it.
Right.
So, I had my graduate advisor, Professor Chris Peterson at Penn, and he started off our graduate program with one slide on a PowerPoint that said, the slide just said, other people matter. And he said, that's the whole program, so you can go home now if you want.
Yeah.
It's like the only thing that all these old psychologists I've gotten to know and worked with agree on is that social relationships are the single biggest driver of our work and our well-being. So I've really learned that if you look at what we can accomplish over a lifetime, professionally and personally, it all comes back to each relationship that we build. And especially when you look at how do we create things that make a difference through our work over a lifetime, all of that is built on the shoulders of people. It's built on the shoulders of people who we learn from as students and that mentor us, and we need to seek that out more actively. That's one thing I learned while working on this book, What's the Point? And so I still every day feel like I'm a student and I'm actively reaching out to mentors and writers and scientists and leaders that I've admired and seeking their advice and maintaining that student learner role. And then I need to also look out to how can I do that and not only be a mentor and teach other people who work for me and work with me, but then also to figure out how do I put knowledge together that will continue to grow when I'm gone. So how can I spend at least 2 hours every day working on something that even if I got hit by a bus tomorrow might still be there for someone else to learn from? And of course, most of what will be there when I'm gone are the relationships with family members, with friends, with people I've worked with that gets to grow after I'm gone. So I think the more you focus like that, it helps.
Sure. Well, piggyback on that a bit. Rather than seeking mentorship, you suggest offering partnership. What does that look like in practice, especially for someone who's pretty early in their career?
Yeah, I think the more that you can reach out to people who are peers or at your level, above your level, whatever it might be, and offer that kind of partnership in how you can do something more effectively and better together than either one of you could individually in isolation. It's been fascinating for me. Two or three of the people I work with most closely, who I kind of talk to every day, one of them I've worked with for 30 years. I had a great meeting with them several months ago where we're all talking about the emergence of AI and these disruptive technologies that are out there today. And the conversation we had is, we've all worked together for many years and made each other better. And our core team of 4 people, we can do the work of maybe 10 or 20 in any other setting. But now each one of us might be able to do 10 times as much. And maybe we can operate at the level of 50 or 100 people if we all challenge ourselves to get better at this. And we all act like peers who are in a whole new industry trying to keep each other accountable for doing a lot more than we even could have thought about 12 months ago, right?
Sure.
So I need the people who I've worked with even for a long time to challenge me more today than they could have a year ago. And that gets me so wound up and excited about the future. It's a real game changer.
Well, that's one of the values of being around smart people.
Yeah.
You can challenge your own thinking. So, Tom, you distinguish between what you call resume virtues, skills that make you valuable in the marketplace, and eulogy virtues, the character traits that define how you will be remembered. How can leaders start investing in eulogy virtues without abandoning the resume virtues that keep them employed?
That's a great one. I think I first read about that from David Brooks' book. I believe it was The Road to Character, where he talked about that distinction between the eulogy virtues versus the resume virtues. And I live across the street, just half a block here from this big sprawling cemetery in Arlington, Virginia. And I often walk through there just to kind of get peace of mind and thought and reflect in the middle of a busy day when it's nice out. And you kind of walk through and you see the headstones that say loving husband and father and friend. And I mean, I've yet to see anything on thousands of headstones I walk by that say anything about how much money someone made or their title selling stuff or how many followers they had.
He was great with spreadsheets.
Yeah. Right. So, I mean, those are the things we spend all this time consumed with and thinking about comparing ourselves to other people, and the stuff that consumes the little dark spots of our reptile brain all day make absolutely no difference once we're under one of those headstones out there. And so I think the more we can reflect on my purpose in a given day is to make sure I'm investing in other people. I'm investing in my own health so that I have energy to be better as a dad and as a leader and as a writer and so forth. And I'm investing in keeping my device stowed away and closing my own mouth, which is even harder than keeping the device stowed away, when I ask somebody a good question so I can genuinely listen. Right. And it's those things that will be remembered by the people who are at our funeral service. And so I think if you take some of that stuff forward, it actually decreases my stress levels and makes things a little bit easier when you think about focusing on what matters in a given day.
My friend Stephen Covey used to talk about how helpful it was to think about and maybe even write down the things you would like for people to be able to say about you at your memorial service. He said, that'll start to give you some focus.
Right.
So you write that a leader's primary product is not a to-do list, but the development of the people around them. For leaders who are genuinely overwhelmed by their own deliverables, which is not uncommon, what does that priority shift require?
It's a really good question because I know how much leaders struggle with that. And I think that the first thing is just prioritizing the people who look to you for leadership and the relationships, as we've talked about. We all hear that a lot, but that has to be the anchor in a given day, because any of our individual abilities to influence without the people around us essentially goes down to somewhere between 0 and 1. So as long as you keep that anchor and what's doing best for the people around you at the top and having developmental check-ins and conversations every single day, I think you'll turn out in a pretty good place over time. The other piece, I think, is to kind of ask yourself if you can rearrange your workday so that it makes it easier to spend more time not only investing in people, but the projects and efforts that create the most meaning and purpose for other people in a given day, and to spend your best energized time, maybe early on in the day for a lot of people, working on those things that require the creative firepower. And it's not the kind of maintenance tasks and responding to emails you'd rather not respond to and expense reports and all those things. Maybe push some of that to the end of the day when you're a little bit fatigued trying to get through stuff and you're not trying to pump as much energy into the world through other people and new projects and creative endeavors. And then also to ask yourself, how can you spend as much time possible using your natural talents, your strengths, what you're really good at every day? Because none of us get to do that all day. I mean, I feel great if I get to spend 30% of my time really using my strengths every day. It's never going to be 90, but make sure that it's at least 10, 15, 20, 30, maybe.
Right. And that requires conscious effort.
Yeah.
Now, you take on what you call the martyr syndrome, the belief that self-sacrifice equals dedication. Why is this myth so persistent in leadership culture, and what's the cost?
Oh, I mean, I could write a whole book on that.
I bet you could.
I grew up in the Midwest, and my dad was a hard-charging salesman who was on the road. He bragged about being on the road 300 days a year and his frequent flyer status and how he never slept. And my grandfather was just brilliant. I looked up to a mentor and father figure to me. Brilliant guy, just worked his butt off. And some of this comes from kind of the early industrial farm ethic where he grew up on a farm where, I mean, working around the clock. That's just kind of the way of life in Nebraska where I grew up. And not only that, but you brag about how little sleep you need and how many hours you've worked. And you wear that like a badge of honor. So
right.
I grew up thinking that is the way in the kind of Star Wars terminology or whatever. And I saw everyone around me do that. And so I still have to challenge myself to dial that back today. I've been working on this book and book launch recently, and I feel like I'm already back into that mode of being guilty about overworking myself and going around the clock when really the best thing I can probably do is to be focused on getting enough sleep, being real active so I have energy for these kind of conversations and making sure I'm eating well and doing all those things. Because the one thing I realized when I worked on a book called Eat, Move, Sleep, kind of based on some of my health research and learnings, is that no matter how good of a leader you are, if you sacrifice your own health every day and you're skipping the workout, you're skipping sleep, and you're eating your lunch over a keyboard and working till 6 or 7 o'clock at night, there is absolutely no way that you will have enough energy to be your best for the people who look to you for leadership and the people who work for you. They see that and they don't feel like they have the permission to take care of themselves. They're not very energized. And you get people in meetings at 3 or 4 p.m. who are operating at about 30% of their capacity.
Right.
So it's just bad for everybody. The leaders I've followed and watched and admired in the last 5 or 10 years, some in the military world, some in the private sector, they are very cognizant about telling their people that they need to value their own health, their own sleep in particular, because boy, sleep is the secret hack and the reset button for being a good leader, the higher up in the levels I get to and talk to. And they make sure that they have healthy options available in the workplace and that they're giving people opportunities to be active and exercise and all that, because it makes them better workers and better leaders, and they're less likely to burn out. So it's a huge and undermanaged and treated piece of work in particular.
Oh, sure. One of the smartest and most effective CEOs I've ever worked with used to tell his people, take your vacation. If I find out at the end of the year you didn't take your vacation, I will not be impressed.
And don't take the vacation and be on the darn device.
Exactly. He would tell them that, focus on your family, focus on whatever you're doing that's not work related. But they had to be told that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and that's kind of expectation of we need those. Everybody needs that time to recharge, and we need to think about on a daily basis and occasionally just getting away and not connecting, because it's those open thoughts where you're not consumed with your work 24/7, where you actually come up with a good idea too.
Yeah, for sure. So, Tom, you challenge people to do a simple exercise. You challenge them to imagine that they have exactly 2 years left and answer 4 questions. 1, what would you start? 2, what would you stop? 3, whom would you spend time with? And 4, what would you create? What does that exercise most commonly surface for people?
It most commonly surfaces a catastrophic misalignment of their priorities versus their time distribution in a given day. And I think that's only getting worse right now too, because I think there's so much demand on not only attention, which we've talked about, but there's also kind of demand on our time pulling in where we don't step back and think about, if the things that really matter are some of those relationships and productively creating things that will make a difference for other people, shouldn't we be spending 80% of our time on that in an ideal day instead of 20% of our time, which most of us struggle to even get to the 20% today.
Right.
So I think if we can back that up and think about that alignment, it leads us to prioritize the people and colleagues at work that matter the most. It leads us to prioritize the highest impact projects and not the stuff that's kind of low hanging fruit that we might be able to put off until we get done with the bigger lifts at work. And it leads us to prioritize better conversations with our friends and family and loved ones. And it leads us to prioritize taking time away. And I mean, there are a lot of people, I just turned 50, and my friends and peers and colleagues who are, especially men at this age, are horrible at prioritizing kind of personal and social relationships with friends. And I've got a good writer friend of mine who's been working on some content around, it just creates kind of an epidemic of loneliness there, because we've all at that point in life gotten so caught up in the work and things we're doing that prioritizing like historical friendships and stuff that's gotten pushed to the very back of every priority list.
Yeah.
When I ask people that question, it brings them back to stuff like that.
And if they're honest with themselves, it can be pretty revealing.
Yeah, it's pretty brutal with some of the conversations I've had.
So you tell about a nurse who was reading aloud to your unconscious dying grandfather with no possibility of recognition or gratitude. You call it the purest form of contribution you had ever witnessed. What did that image rewire in you?
You know, it's fascinating to me because my grandfather had been the one that taught me that the whole point of life is what you do for others. And that was kind of inherently what I've learned from him over all those years. And he just spent his life just going nonstop to make sure that people uncovered their strengths and were better managers and leaders. And that was his thing. And when he was battling cancer, I traveled all over the country with him, trying to keep him alive as long as possible while we were working on the book, How Full Is Your Bucket, which was all about filling other people's buckets and doing things that make a difference. So, I mean, that was kind of our main thing. But yet, when I kind of walked down that hallway and I could hear the hospice nurse reading to him after he was already beyond consciousness, and she didn't do it because it was a task. She kind of read with all the normal emotion that you normally would if someone was really paying attention and listening.
Right.
And I kind of sat there and it struck me because I realized that for her to be able to do that just purely for the kind of existential, altruistic mission of it, without even getting any recognition from your patient and not knowing that I was there as a family member listening, is kind of like the next level of what we talk about in this book in terms of doing things for other people because it serves such a deep and profound purpose and mission and meaning. So I'm still trying to get my head around how people kind of get to that level.
So you've spent decades studying workplace engagement. What does purpose look like as an organization, not just individual, as a phenomenon? And why has the engagement crisis seemed to persist despite so much attention?
I think there's a little bit of a disconnect with people thinking about purpose as something much larger than it really is. And that feeds into what I see, at least in some of the crisis around engagement, where people are thinking the answer to engagement is just being more fulfilled or having a different manager or some of the basic aspects of what's going on in a day at work, where we probably need to develop better and more systemic mechanisms for kind of feedback loops so that workers have more line of sight to who they're serving each day and the difference that makes. One of the most profound examples from my research a couple of books ago was, I'm a cancer survivor for 30 plus years now. And I would have imagined that if you're a radiologist, that you're just doing your best work and you see the mission and meaning because you're helping cancer patients to stay alive, right? But as a part of an experiment with radiologists, where they had one group of radiologists keep doing their jobs and a separate experimental group, all they did was append a photo of the patient to the radiographic record. And that yielded like 43% longer reports and increased diagnostic accuracy by about a third.
It was real people.
Real people. So sometimes just clipping a photo so you see the face of who you serve and it's not just some mindless number coming in on your email or screen, right? I mean, there are these little things we have to do. And it's just sort of saying, how do we infuse the humanity of who we serve back into the daily routine? It's not a leader at an annual offsite preaching about why purpose matters. I've figured that out after all these years. It's individuals and work teams saying, how can we build a feedback loop back in so that whether you're in a call center or a retail store or a corporate headquarters office or a manufacturing plant, you can kind of see who we're serving each day, or at least the difference that it makes if you can't see that very directly.
Well, Tom, your book is just chock full of pearls of wisdom. Let me ask this final question. If people read What's the Point and take only one idea into their lives, one shift in how they see themselves and their work, what do you most hope that idea is?
I think that it's the and this kind of dovetails with the subtitle of the book, which is about turning purpose into your daily superpower. And I think the one thing I'd hope people take away is that you have to own purpose yourself and make it into kind of a verb and something you do every day. And purpose is the conversation you have that turns a customer around. Purpose is the conversation you have that inspires a colleague. Purpose is the 20 minutes you invest in a deep and meaningful conversation with a friend, a spouse, or one of your kids. And if you see those activities as purpose every day, that's where it really becomes something that's, almost kind of the center of your daily work routine, essentially.
Tom Rath, thank you so much for joining us on Leadership. Tom reminds us that purpose is not a distant destination. It's a daily decision. Purpose is not something you find once and hold on to forever. It's something you activate in the next meeting, the next conversation, the next choice about how you spend your time. And perhaps the most powerful shift he offers is this: stop asking, what do I want? And start asking, whom does this help? That single question has the potential to transform not only your work, but your sense of meaning. So don't wait for a wake-up call. Ask yourself every morning as you plan your day, what's the point? And if the answer isn't clear, maybe that's your signal for some serious soul searching. Be sure to leave a review of our podcast. Every single sentence fuels the algorithms that promote the great content that the Leadership podcast provides. And for free resources to help you in your leadership journey, go to leadership.net. That's leadership.net. Thanks again for joining us. Until next time, stay safe, be happy, and spread good cheer wherever you go. For Leadership, I'm Rodger Dean Duncan.